I've never spoken about this outside professional circles, never. But the other day, I was stuck in traffic, listening to a video on my phone, and I heard a young man telling a story about a body that vanished from a funeral home with strange marks on it. And that hit me in a way I can't fully explain, because what I'm about to share with you has nothing spiritual about it, no legend attached to it, no curse woven into its fabric. But it's so sickening, so utterly absurd and so unspeakably cruel that to this day I question what my own eyes witnessed and what my own hands touched. This story unfolded in 2014, during the early hours of a Tuesday morning, and it changed something fundamental in how I see the world. I was the technical supervisor on duty that night at the medical examiner's office here in Salvador. By that time, I already carried 30 years of professional experience on my shoulders. Decomposed bodies had become routine for me. The desperate screams of mothers, people riddled with bullet wounds, all of it common. But that particular body didn't arrive like any ordinary cadaver I'd ever processed. It came sealed, delivered straight from the funeral home, with an official sticker plastered across the top of the coffin lid, stating that the viewing had lasted 5 hours. The deceased was a 39-year-old man, death certificate citing fulminant cardiac arrest, signed off by a new resident at the state hospital. And if his mother hadn't insisted, hadn't fought with every fiber of her being, that man would have turned to dust before we ever lifted that lid. The funeral home staff brought him in themselves, arriving somewhat tense, moving with an urgency that felt misplaced. But since the requisition came bearing the name of the hospital director and all the proper stamps, nobody questioned anything initially. But I'm old road, as we say, and the moment I laid eyes on that coffin, something stirred in my gut, telling me things weren't right. First observation: the wood of the casket showed signs of internal moisture, which made no sense. Second, there was no smell of necrosis, none whatsoever. Instead, there was this sweet but sour odor, as if something living was breathing inside that box. ¿Has considerado cómo muchas veces ignoramos las señales que gritan frente a nosotros, simplemente porque la verdad es demasiado perturbadora para enfrentar? And what truly sent chills racing down my spine was this. When we positioned the coffin onto the autopsy table, it gave a slight oscillation, as if something was shifting inside, something with weight and intention. I don't panic easily, never have in all my years, but I took a deep breath and told my support technician with deliberate calm, "Turn on the camera in the corner. I want everything recorded, and prepare yourself for what we might find." When I finally opened that lid, the body appeared different from what I expected. The face was pallid, eyes closed and secured with tape, standard procedure. But what immediately caught my attention was his chest, still maintaining a degree of firmness that shouldn't have been there. There was no flaccidity, none of the typical limpness we expect after so many hours post-mortem, and the abdominal region was distended far beyond normal, as if filled with gas, but without the characteristic bloating pattern of putrefaction. This was a living swelling, if such a thing could exist. I requested the scalpel, steadying my hand. That first incision running from the umbilicus to the sternum became the worst moment of my entire professional life, bar none. The instant the blade penetrated the skin layer, there erupted a writhing mass of white larvae, alive and active, literally jumping outward from the abdominal cavity as if they'd been desperately waiting for air, for light, for release. They were large, numerous beyond counting, thrashing with terrible vitality, emerging coated in a clear slime mixed with a fluid that carried an almost acidic odor that burned the nostrils. My technician vomited right there on the floor. I froze completely, unable to process what I was seeing. Never, not once in 30 years had I witnessed this phenomenon. Living larvae in active movement inside a body that supposedly had been dead for nearly 8 hours. But then came the discovery that truly made my blood run cold, that made me question everything I thought I understood about death. The intestine was still performing peristaltic movement, the wave-like contractions that push contents through the digestive tract. Anyone in this field knows with absolute certainty that this only occurs in organisms with residual nervous activity, with some spark of life still flickering. In other words, that man had been sealed inside that coffin while still breathing, while still alive. I opened the thorax with trembling hands. The heart appeared shrunken, yes, collapsed, but the vessels remained moist, lacking the complete collapse we see in true death. I returned to examine the paperwork more carefully. Time of death listed 2:17 p.m. We received the body at 10:23 p.m., but what lay before me didn't show even 3 hours of true death. Déjame en los comentarios tu reflexión comenzando con "Yo me comprometo a", porque cuando compartimos nuestros compromisos con la verdad, cuando declaramos nuestra intención de no cerrar los ojos ante lo incómodo, creamos una comunidad de conciencia que se niega a permanecer en silencio ante las injusticias que ocurren en las sombras. Listen, if nobody here knows me or my credentials, perhaps you'll doubt these words, but anyone working in this field understands with crystal clarity. Larvae don't form in fresh bodies, and they don't invade from outside to inside through a sealed coffin, not in this pattern, not with this vigor. Those larvae were deposited there while he still drew breath, while his body still fought. And somehow, for some terrible stretch of time, that man coexisted with those creatures feeding inside him, conscious or unconscious of the horror taking place within his own flesh. I had to investigate further, couldn't let this rest. I needed to know who this young man was, what had brought him to this unthinkable end. His name doesn't matter now, serves no purpose in this telling, but what I discovered through his mother, that's what matters. She sought me out, frantic and nervous, desperate for answers. She told me her son had been admitted to the hospital the previous night, experiencing what they called an episode, a breakdown. He screamed, thrashed violently, suffered a convulsion that terrified everyone present. According to her testimony, they administered sedatives, heavy ones, and then announced he'd entered a deep coma state. 2 hours later, just 2 hours, they declared brain death without showing any examination results, without allowing her to see her son in the ICU, without any of the normal protocols. And then, most suspiciously, they closed the coffin at the wake, claiming his face had become deformed, unsuitable for viewing. She didn't believe them, refused to accept it, insisted with a mother's intuition that something was desperately wrong, screamed until her voice gave out, and finally managed to have the body redirected to our facility for proper examination. But if she hadn't fought that battle, if she'd simply accepted what they told her, he would have been buried with everything still living inside him, with the truth sealed away forever in the earth. But here comes the part that nobody wants to hear, the part that makes this story transform from tragedy into something darker, something systematic. The following day, I attempted to enter the hospital to request the medical records, the full patient file. I was barred at the entrance, turned away without explanation. I returned with an official signed order, proper legal documentation that couldn't be ignored. They told me, without meeting my eyes, that the patient's file had been misplaced, somehow lost in their system. The death certificate, they claimed, had been filled out by a new resident, someone inexperienced who, coincidentally, was removed from that night's shift immediately afterward and never appeared again at the hospital, vanished like smoke. No forwarding information, no disciplinary record, nothing. The walls of silence closed around this case so quickly, so completely, that I knew I was touching something much bigger than one unexplained death, something protected by people with power and resources. And that is where my investigation hit a wall I couldn't climb, a barrier I couldn't penetrate, no matter how hard I tried. I went to the funeral home that had handled the transport, needing answers that nobody seemed willing to provide. One of the young men there, visibly nervous and constantly glancing over his shoulder, pulled me aside into a corner and said in a hushed voice, "Doctor, that coffin arrived to us already sealed shut. We weren't supposed to open it, just conduct a quick viewing and transport it directly for cremation." I felt my stomach drop as I asked, "Cremation?" But the family never authorized that. He looked down at his feet, unable to meet my gaze, and said with a tremor in his voice, "Exactly, sir. Everything was already arranged for that, all the paperwork processed and ready. It was the mother who blocked it at the very last minute, who demanded the body be taken to the medical examiner's office instead." I returned to the institute, burning with righteous anger, determined to document everything I'd discovered. I prepared the most thorough report of my career, including every detail. I registered the true estimated time of death based on the physical evidence before me, catalogued the larval activity with precise measurements and observations, documented the residual movements that defied all normal post-mortem patterns, everything meticulously recorded according to protocol. The very next day, my access credentials were suspended without warning or explanation. I received formal notification of immediate leave due to alleged emotional instability, a diagnosis made without anyone ever speaking to me. They claimed I needed psychiatric evaluation before I could continue signing official documents, before I could be trusted with the responsibility I'd carried flawlessly for 3 decades. I thought surely this must be some kind of bureaucratic mistake, perhaps even a dark joke, but it wasn't, not even remotely. My report vanished from the system as if it had never existed. The body disappeared from our facility without proper chain of custody documentation. The entire case evaporated like morning mist, leaving no trace in any official record. The following month, something arrived that changed everything again. I received a plain brown envelope with no return address, no markings of any kind, just my name written in generic block letters. Inside was a single printed photograph, extracted and enlarged from the corner camera footage of the autopsy room, the very recording I had specifically requested. ¿Qué pasaría si en este momento descubrieras que alguien ha estado observando cada verdad incómoda que intentaste revelar, documentando tu valentía, no para protegerte, sino para advertirte de cuán lejos puedes llegar? It captured the exact moment of that first incision, but in the enlargement, in the magnified depths of the abdominal cavity, there was something I hadn't noticed during the actual procedure, something that had been waiting there all along, a small piece of paper, carefully folded, tucked deliberately between the lobes of the liver, as if placed there by surgical hands. The photograph zoomed in with chilling clarity, and on that paper was a single word scrawled in what appeared to be coagulated blood, dark and deliberate. "Awake. You want to know what truly destroyed me after receiving that envelope?" It wasn't the photograph itself, as disturbing as it was. It wasn't even that word written in blood, that terrible confirmation of consciousness. What shattered something fundamental inside me was the realization that someone wanted me to see this, that someone embedded within the entire system, whether in our team at the funeral home or even inside the hospital itself, knew exactly what had happened and deliberately allowed it to proceed anyway. And beyond that horror, they had preserved evidence, kept proof, as if sending me a message written in the language of impunity. "You saw it, you opened him, you understood the truth, but there's absolutely nothing you can do about it." I kept that photograph hidden for years, concealed in a place where even I rarely looked at it. I showed it to nobody, not even during internal review processes that came later, because at that point it was no longer a matter of formal denunciation or proper channels. This had transformed into a question of personal safety, of survival in a world where certain truths carry lethal consequences. After that day, I was officially removed from technical coordination, stripped of the position I'd earned through decades of impeccable service. They transferred me to administrative assessments, pushing me far away from the autopsy tables, from the bodies that might tell stories someone didn't want heard. They claimed it was due to my age, citing policy and procedure, but I understood the real message. This was silencing, pure and simple. I worked as a medical examiner for over 40 years, and I've seen it all. But one case, just one, stole my appetite for months. It was a 19-year-old girl brought in from a downtown hotel. The official report said it was a simple overdose, cardiorespiratory arrest, but when they wheeled her into my examination room, my gut told me something was deeply wrong. It started with the smell. It wasn't just decomposition. It was a strange mix of stale coffee and industrial bleach. Then her abdomen was unnaturally rigid, but her body felt too light, as if something was missing. The weight of her organs, that characteristic heft, simply wasn't there. That absence screamed wrongness to my experienced hands. This case, the one with the nylon, is the reason I know some mysteries are far darker than death itself. Stay with me to find out what we discovered. I didn't voice my concerns aloud to my assistant, just made careful notations in the preliminary examination record. But that observation had already tied a knot in my gut, that familiar tension that comes when you know you're about to uncover something terrible, and I understood with complete certainty that if I proceeded with examining this body, I would have to follow the evidence all the way to whatever dark conclusion waited at the end. I began the standard procedure, making the Y incision carefully, separating tissue layers with practiced precision, conducting the initial internal assessment that should have been routine, and it was in the abdomen where everything began to unravel into something beyond my comprehension. When I reached the stomach during the standard organ examination, I discovered it had been sutured from the inside, stitched closed in a way that defied every protocol I'd learned over 4 decades. Yes, I know exactly what you're thinking right now, the logical explanation forming in your mind. Internal suturing happens in surgery all the time, doesn't it? This could be from some previous intervention, perhaps a gastrointestinal procedure, maybe bariatric surgery from years before. But this wasn't that. Nothing remotely close to legitimate medical care. This was nylon thread, black nylon, surgical-grade filament, yes, but with manual stitching that was deliberately crude, lacking the consistent spacing between sutures that any trained surgeon would maintain, sewn from the inside in a manner designed to conceal something, not to heal tissue or repair damage. And behind the liver, positioned in a location nearly impossible to detect without forcefully lifting the organ and examining the hidden spaces beneath, there was a zipper embedded in the tissue, an actual zipper, small and made of plastic, surgically attached directly to the gastric wall, as if the human body were merely a garment that could be opened and closed at convenience. In that moment, I stopped all movement, set down my scalpel with trembling fingers, and simply stared at what lay exposed before me. I had never, not once in my entire career spanning thousands of examinations, witnessed anything remotely like this construction, and I knew with absolute certainty that from this point forward, every action I took would leave permanent marks, would create consequences I couldn't predict, because this wasn't medical error or malpractice. This wasn't a drug overdose gone wrong, wasn't even smuggling contraband in the traditional sense we sometimes encountered. This was staging, deliberate theatrical construction, a body prepared and modified to appear as if it had died from one cause while actually carrying something else entirely, something that required this level of invasive preparation. ¿Te has preguntado por qué algunas verdades son tan cuidadosamente escondidas dentro de cuerpos que ya no pueden hablar, como si el silencio de la muerte fuera la única garantía de que ciertos secretos permanecerán enterrados para siempre? I picked up long forceps with hands that wanted to shake, carefully repositioned the surrounding tissue to gain better access, and slowly opened that zipper with movements that felt surreal, as if I'd stepped out of medical reality into some nightmare logic. The stomach had been relined from the inside with what appeared to be synthetic skin, a polymer membrane adhered with surgical-grade adhesive, carefully molded to coat the organ's interior and transform it into a protective capsule for whatever cargo it contained. There inside this biological safe, wrapped in the violation of human tissue, sat a cylindrical plastic piece, a tube with a sealing mechanism, much like a toothbrush travel case you might purchase at any pharmacy. When I opened it with movements that felt like desecration, despite my professional authority, the contents spilled onto my examination tray with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent room. 8 gelatin capsules, each one, bearing a numerical label printed with precise clarity. These weren't drugs. Showed none of the characteristics I'd learned to recognize over decades. There was no narcotic smell, no chemical signature. They didn't dissolve when I tested them with saline solution. And inside one of them, folded with origami-like precision, was a slip of white paper printed in grey ink that made my blood run cold when I read its message. Lot 48 of 12. Clean material, patient harvested successfully, transport confirmed. My hand trembled as I held that paper, and I need you to understand this isn't figurative language or dramatic embellishment. My hand physically shook in a way it never had before, not when I'd held the severed head of a decapitation victim, not when I'd examined the small body of a drowned child, not even when I'd pieced together an elderly person dismembered in what appeared to be ritual violence. But this violated something deeper than those horrors, because those were crimes of passion, of madness, of human darkness I could at least comprehend. This coldness, this clinical precision, this reduction of a 19-year-old girl to a container, a transport vessel that was a different species of evil entirely. She hadn't been used to smuggle drugs across borders or deliver contraband to criminal networks. She'd been converted into a biological courier for medical material, some form of harvested samples that required human transport, that needed the concealment only a corpse could provide. Te invito a escribir en los comentarios completando la frase «Yo agradezco porque cuando expresamos gratitud por la valentía de quienes se niegan a mirar hacia otro lado, por aquellos que documentan lo indocumentable incluso cuando les cuesta todo, creamos un reconocimiento colectivo que honra la verdad por encima del silencio cómodo». I closed the case carefully, preserving the evidence with methodical precision. I photographed everything from multiple angles, using the department camera, repeated the entire examination process, wearing fresh gloves to avoid any contamination accusations, recorded video documentation while speaking only what was absolutely necessary for the official record, and saved everything in an encrypted folder within the Institute's computer system, following every protocol that might protect this evidence from disappearing. But I took too long, spent too many minutes ensuring thorough documentation. There were about 20 minutes remaining until the end of my shift when the computer system froze, and I mean completely locked up without warning. The report page stopped responding. I attempted to save the draft version, tried to submit the incomplete protocol through backup channels. Nothing worked, every pathway blocked. When I arrived at the Institute the following morning, carrying coffee and the weight of what I'd discovered, my access credentials had been suspended without any advance notification. The official explanation cited unauthorized access error on the main server, a vague technical accusation that couldn't be challenged. The official report for her case had already been completed and digitally signed by another physician whose name I didn't recognize. His conclusion: cardiac arrest caused by mixed intoxication of controlled substances, behavior consistent with documented history of substance abuse, case closed, file sealed, investigation unnecessary. The photographs I'd carefully taken had been replaced in the system with images of a completely different body, not even remotely the same person. This substitute was a woman appearing to be around 40 years old, with different bone structure, different tissue characteristics, entirely different. I immediately went searching for the original patient intake form, the physical paperwork that should have existed as backup. It had been archived in the filing system, buried at the very back of a storage cabinet where old cases went to be forgotten. I found it there covered in dust, and in the lower corner, written so small it was almost imperceptible, was a handwritten notation in blue ballpoint pen. Concluded. Cycle TR. Should not return. Those words embedded themselves in my consciousness like splinters I couldn't remove. I repeated them mentally for weeks afterward, turning them over in my mind during sleepless nights. Cycle of what exactly? Who shouldn't return, and from where? Why that specific phrasing that suggested repetition, routine, system? The following week I began investigating those capsule labels, trying to decode their meaning. The alphanumeric codes appeared random at first glance, deliberately obscured, but portions of them triggered recognition, reminded me of an outdated cataloging system for biological samples I'd seen decades earlier. I researched through old medical journals and archived protocols, and finally found the match that confirmed my worst suspicions. Those labels originated from an international genetic manipulation project that had been suspended in Brazil in 2008, following formal denunciations about irregular use of volunteers, people enrolled without proper documentation or informed consent, bodies used without ethical oversight. This girl's stomach contained Lot 4, Capsule 8 of 12, according to the labeling system, but only 8 capsules had been present inside her violated body. Where had the other 4 capsules gone? Into what other corpses had they been surgically implanted? I didn't sleep that night, couldn't close my eyes without seeing that zipper, that synthetic lining. And no, this isn't exaggeration for dramatic effect. This is literal truth. Sleep abandoned me for many nights in succession. I was summoned to an internal meeting the following month, presented as informal, just a conversation between colleagues. Nothing official recorded. No witnesses beyond the 3 men who sat across from me in that windowless room. They offered me compulsory retirement with full benefits intact, no scandal attached to my name, no uncomfortable questions asked, complete discretion guaranteed if I simply walked away and forgot what I'd seen. I accepted their offer because I understood the alternative they weren't stating directly, the consequences that silence was meant to avoid. But before I left that building for the final time, before I surrendered my credentials and my access to the truth, I did one last thing that they never knew about. I saved the complete file, everything I'd documented, onto an old USB drive that I concealed inside a medication box, along with physical copies of that girl's intake form and the handwritten notation that haunted me. I never showed these materials to anyone, never spoke about them even to people I trusted, kept them hidden like radioactive material too dangerous to expose. But if you're hearing this now, if these words have reached your ears, it's because the time has finally come for this testimony. Because I saw what I saw, touched what I touched with my own hands, and none of it was accidental, none of it was random tragedy. In the second part of this account, I'm going to tell you what I witnessed years later, what I stumbled upon that made me vomit in a hospital parking lot, just from the memory of black nylon thread and that zipper sewn into human flesh, the connection that finally revealed the full scope of what that girl's body had been used for. I spent roughly 2 years refusing to even touch the subject of autopsies after that discovery. Couldn't bring myself to engage with that world anymore. I stopped reading forensic reports that colleagues occasionally sent, avoided news coverage of deaths no matter how prominent, wouldn't speak with former shift partners even when they reached out, wanting to reminisce about easier times. I retired truly and completely. withdrew from the medical examiner community entirely, but that girl's body never left my mind. Haunted me not because of her specifically as an individual, though she deserved better than what happened to her, but because of everything she represented in death. That hand-stitched, nylon thread-pulling tissue into unnatural configurations, that zipper embedded in human flesh, like hardware in a machine, those numbered capsules with their cryptic labels. And above all, the overwhelming sensation that none of this was error or accident, but rather established protocol, routine procedure in some shadow system I'd glimpsed only for a moment. I always knew there had to be more behind what I'd discovered, a larger structure supporting that single horrific case. But I never expected to see that mark again, never imagined I'd encounter evidence of continuation. Because I did see it again years later, without searching for it, without any intention of revisiting that nightmare. It happened in 2022, a random afternoon when I'd gone to visit a friend, hospitalized at a private medical facility here in Belo Horizonte. He was undergoing renal treatment, dialysis 3 times weekly, and I'd promised to keep him company during the lonely hours. While standing in the parking lot afterward, waiting for my taxi to arrive, and thinking about nothing in particular, I happened to glance at a poster mounted on the wall of the clinical research wing, one of those glossy institutional announcements that usually advertise flu shots or diabetes screenings. This one promoted a new international research project in partnership with several European universities, presented with all the legitimacy of academic collaboration. Up to that point, nothing seemed unusual or alarming, just another medical study seeking participants. But then my eyes drifted to the lower corner of that poster, to the small logo printed there among the institutional seals and university crests. And my entire body went cold with recognition. ¿Recuerdas la última vez que algo del pasado regresó a tu vida, disfrazado de progreso, vestido con palabras hermosas, pero llevando exactamente la misma oscuridad que creías haber dejado atrás? It was the exact same symbol that had appeared on capsule number 7, the one I'd photographed years earlier with trembling hands. A simple geometric design, a kind of incomplete triangle with a spiral pattern contained within its borders, distinctive enough that there could be no mistake about the identification. At the time of the original autopsy, I'd assumed it was merely some technical marking, catalogue notation used internally by whatever laboratory had produced those capsules. But here it was, displayed prominently on an institutional banner, printed large and professional, which meant something devastating had become clear. This was the same organization, the same origin point, the same people responsible, only now operating under a beautiful name, presenting themselves as a transparent project with public protocols and ethical oversight. I swear to you, my stomach twisted violently in that parking lot because the entire memory returned with sensory completeness, flooded back as if I were standing in that autopsy room again. I could see the internal suturing pulling tissue into unnatural arrangements, the gastric wall stretched and modified, that zipper sliding open with thick secretions coating the metal teeth. And worst of all, that phrase printed on paper in grey ink, patient harvested successfully, as if she had participated willingly, as if this had been her choice somehow. The truth, the unbearable truth that I'd tried to bury along with my career, was that she hadn't harvested anything voluntarily. She had been transformed into a container, assembled like packaging for valuable cargo. There was no record of hospital admission in her file, no volunteer consent forms, no documentation of participation in any study. Only that mark left inside her stomach like a brand of ownership. And you think this practice stopped in 2008 when that initial project was supposedly shut down? Of course it didn't end, not even close. That was merely the pilot program, the experimental phase before full implementation. After that day in the parking lot, after seeing that logo resurrected and legitimized, I began investigating again, but this time with far greater caution born from experience. I used public library computers and cafe Wi-Fi networks, left no digital trail connected to my identity. I searched through archived medical forums, obscure academic papers from international universities that nobody reads except specialists, documents buried in databases that required persistence to access. And gradually, piece by piece, I began finding sanitized versions of the exact same thing I'd discovered years earlier. Research proposals for long-term in vivo collection studies, trials testing biological capacity for internal transport without triggering immunological interference, protocols for discrete storage within adapted human tissue presented as cutting-edge medical innovation. Everything wrapped in technical language, everything made to sound beautiful and beneficial to humanity. But I understand that language can read between the carefully chosen words. Escribe en los comentarios una intención que empiece con "yo decido", porque cuando declaramos nuestras decisiones de no permanecer ignorantes, cuando elegimos conscientemente mirar más allá de las palabras hermosas hacia las acciones reales, nos convertimos en testigos que el silencio institucional ya no puede controlar. And what does all this sophisticated terminology actually mean when you strip away the academic camouflage? At its core, it describes only one thing: people serving as boxes, human beings used as compartments, living bodies reduced to tools for transport and storage. Some of these people, probably most of them, might never know what was done to them, might never discover the modifications made while they were unconscious or sedated. Perhaps they're selected from marginalized groups, populations without families to ask questions, without documented histories, without anyone who would file complaints or demand investigations after they disappear. Others perhaps die during the procedure itself and become convenient statistics, deaths attributed to drug overdoses, just like that 19-year-old girl whose stomach I opened, whose violation I documented before they erased every trace. And you listening to this right now might think I'm exaggerating for dramatic effect, engaging in conspiracy thinking or paranoid speculation. But I'm speaking with the voice of someone who had that body on his examination table, who cut through that modified tissue with surgical instruments, who saw black nylon thread stretched across the interior of a human stomach, who touched evidence that cannot be explained away or rationalized as anything other than what it was. The most sickening part isn't even the physical violation itself, as horrific as that undeniably is. It's the realization, the unavoidable conclusion, that someone is doing this systematically, year after year, using legitimate medical knowledge, operating within real hospitals with institutional approval, accessing public resources and funding, and efficiently silencing anyone who attempts to report what they've discovered. That 19-year-old girl wasn't the first victim of this system, couldn't possibly have been the initial experiment. And she certainly wasn't the last, because the program continued, evolved, improved its techniques. She completed Cycle TR, as that handwritten notation stated with chilling, bureaucratic brevity. I find myself wondering constantly if there exists a Cycle 4, some other type of human container they've developed, another method of transport they've perfected through practice on bodies nobody claims. The project name has changed over the years, been rebranded with focus group-tested appeal. Now the promotional materials feature beautiful words carefully selected for public consumption: ethics, innovation, collaborative science, medical advancement, human benefit. But I know what exists beneath that glossy surface, can recognize the underlying structure despite the cosmetic changes. I extracted those capsules myself. I saw the surgical adhesive still moist from recent application. I opened that zipper with my own trembling hands. And even after all these years have passed, even after attempting to forget and move forward with whatever remained of my life, the smell of nylon, mixed with bile and chemical preservatives, still lingers in the back of my throat, returns in moments of stress or during sleepless nights. This isn't some invented horror story crafted for entertainment, not fiction designed to frighten or thrill listeners. This is simply one dirty fragment of reality, the kind that nobody wants to believe exists, because acknowledging it would require action, would demand we confront how easily humans can be reduced to resources. But it's there, sewn inside where inspection rarely reaches, waiting for the right moment to open again, to reveal itself to someone else who won't be able to forget what they've seen. If you've made it this far through this testimony, if you're still listening rather than dismissing these words as impossible exaggeration, it's because you can handle hearing the truth, even when it's ugly. Subscribe to this channel, because the heaviest stories, the ones that will truly test your capacity to accept what humans do to each other, those are still coming. Fingerprints don't erase. You need to understand that fundamental fact. You can scrape away skin with blades, pour acid to burn through tissue layers, sand the fingertips with industrial abrasives, but the pattern returns as new skin forms, the ridges and whorls emerge again, because they're encoded deeper than surface tissue. It might take time for regeneration, but the print comes back, reasserts itself. There exists only one situation where fingerprints truly don't appear, won't manifest, no matter how long you wait. When they never existed in the first place. When someone was born without them, or had them surgically removed at the dermal level. I worked 33 years inside the Medical Examiners Institute, spent most of my adult life in those fluorescent-lit rooms. I started as a technical assistant, the lowest position in the hierarchy, and worked my way up through dedication and competence to eventually become director of the East Zone unit. I witnessed everything imaginable during those decades, processed every type of death and violence humans inflict on each other, and then encountered things beyond what I'd imagined possible. But there's one case that lodged itself in my throat, stuck there like something I can't swallow or cough up, and I'm only speaking about it now because it returned in a different form, different face attached to a different body, but presenting exactly the same impossible absence. The first case arrived in 2008, announced by a phone call on an ordinary morning shortly before lunch break. Male body discovered lifeless in the parking lot of a 24-hour supermarket near the radial highway, found by early morning shoppers. Initial report indicated no signs of apparent violence, no blood pooling or spatter, no visible wounds or injuries, not even minor scratches on the exposed skin. The body carried no identification whatsoever, no documents in pockets, no wallet, no phone, not even a receipt for gum or coffee, nothing to indicate who this person had been in life. I transported the body to the autopsy table, already mentally categorizing it as another indigent case, one more anonymous death to process and file away. But then, during standard procedure, we always begin with fingerprint collection for identification purposes. I attempted the process first, using our automated scanning system, the digital reader that should capture prints in seconds. Nothing registered, completely blank. I switched to direct ink application, the old-fashioned method that's more reliable with difficult cases. Still, nothing appeared on the card. I tried the silver nitrate method, the technique that reveals sweat residue on dried or damaged skin, that brings out impressions even when standard methods fail. Again, absolutely nothing. The finger was smooth, and I need you to understand this isn't figurative expression or exaggeration. The fingertip was genuinely smooth, lacking any texture whatsoever, like the skin of a newborn infant before friction patterns develop fully. Except this wasn't a baby, wasn't a child at all. This was a fully grown man, approximately 35 years old, based on physical development, with a well-maintained body showing signs of regular exercise and good nutrition. But he had no scars anywhere, no calluses from work or activity, no bumps or irregularities, no cracked heels from walking, no body hair on his arms or legs, nothing. In my official report description, I documented with clinical precision: skin intact, absent of calluses, scars, or natural folds, epidermal surface presenting abnormally smooth appearance on digital pads, complete absence of visible papillary ridges. I felt deeply uncomfortable with these findings, but I followed protocol exactly. We submitted photographs to various databases, collected samples for dental comparison and DNA analysis that were never claimed by anyone, and officially registered him as indigent with a case number, but no name attached. Approximately 14 days later, something unexpected happened that transformed this from strange case to genuinely disturbing mystery. A nurse from the emergency clinic appeared at my department, arriving outside official channels without appointment or formal request. She was visibly nervous, clutching a thin folder against her chest, and she recognized me from a television interview I'd given months earlier about a helicopter accident investigation. She approached asking for just 1 minute of my time, just 60 seconds. She explained that she had treated that man 2 days before his death was officially recorded, that he'd walked into her facility under his own power. According to her testimony, he'd arrived complaining of stomach pain, describing it as sharp and constant, but he refused to allow anyone to touch him, wouldn't permit any physical examination. He kept insisting he had an allergy to hospital touch, whatever that meant. She told me this was the 3rd or 4th time he'd appeared at that facility, always arriving with a different complaint, different symptoms described, but the name never matched previous visits, changed each time he walked through those doors. What had captured her attention, what made her remember this particular patient among the hundreds she treated monthly, was that his medical intake form always vanished from the digital system within hours of his departure, erased as if he'd never been there at all. And when she attempted to photograph his information to show her supervisor, to document this strange pattern, her phone froze completely and the files deleted themselves without her touching anything. Yes, I know how absurd that sounds, how much it resembles paranoid conspiracy theory rather than medical testimony. I thought the same thing initially, dismissed it as technical malfunction combined with overactive imagination. But what left me genuinely troubled, what I couldn't shake off, was the way she spoke about these experiences, carrying the exhausted tone of someone who had tried reporting this before, had attempted to raise alarms, but nobody ever took her seriously, nobody ever investigated. 2 weeks after that conversation in my office, after she'd entrusted me with information that clearly frightened her, I learned through professional channels that this nurse had submitted her resignation and vanished completely from the public health network. No advance notice given, no forwarding contact information, no explanation to colleagues, simply gone, as if she'd never existed in that system. I went searching for her records in the Nursing Council registry, thinking I might track her down for follow-up questions. Nothing appeared under that name, no license, no employment history, no record of her ever having worked in medical care anywhere in the state. It was as though the person who'd stood in my office had been erased along with those patient files she'd described. I filed this story away in the corner of my mind, kept a copy of the original autopsy report and related files, stored separately on external drives, just as a precaution, though I didn't know what I was protecting against. The second case arrived 12 years later, long after I thought I'd left this world behind forever. I was already officially retired from active duty, but I still accepted occasional external consulting work for particularly technical cases that required experienced analysis. In 2020, during a task force assembled after a devastating fire in an abandoned building downtown, I was called to assist with body triage and identification. The majority of victims emerged carbonized beyond recognition, reduced to ash and bone fragments that required DNA analysis. Except for one body, one impossible exception. This victim had been extracted from the building's basement level without a single scratch visible, removed from what should have been an inferno completely intact. The face showed partial disfigurement from falling structural debris, concrete and metal that had collapsed during the blaze, but the body itself remained perfect, showing no burn marks whatsoever, no smoke residue in the respiratory passages, appearing exactly as if this person had never been inside a fire at all, had simply been placed there after the flames were extinguished. ¿No crees que es tiempo de preguntarnos cuántas imposibilidades hemos normalizado, cuántas ausencias hemos dejado pasar sin cuestionar simplemente porque enfrentar la verdad requeriría que admitiéramos que no controlamos ni comprendemos el mundo tanto como creemos? I began the standard protocol once more, searching for documents that didn't exist, attempting fingerprint collection that I already suspected would fail. And indeed, the digital prints simply weren't there, couldn't be captured by any method in our arsenal. The official justification written by an inexperienced technician stated with bureaucratic confidence impressions not collected due to supposed thermal damage. But there was no thermal damage present, none whatsoever. The skin remained completely whole, intact, and absolutely smooth once again, lacking those ridges and patterns that should exist on every human being who's ever lived. That's when something pulled at my memory, demanded I make a connection I'd been avoiding. I went back to compare this case with the one from 2008, pulled those old files from my personal archives. Same estimated age range based on bone development and tissue condition, identical physical type and body structure, same complete absence of any identification markers or documents. And then I noticed a detail that made my blood freeze in my veins, made the room feel suddenly colder. A scar shaped like two connected J's, positioned just below the left clavicle. Exact same location, identical angulation and size. This wasn't coincidence, couldn't be explained by probability or chance. That realization swallowed me from the inside, consumed my thoughts completely. I returned home that evening, barely remembering the drive. Went straight to an old external hard drive I used for storing backup copies of reports and unofficial documentation from my career. I located a folder containing draft documents, some of which I didn't even remember creating, accumulated fragments from decades of work. But there was one email that stopped me cold, a draft message that had never been sent, saved under my IP address, my account credentials, my name attached. The subject line read, Case 321B, complete absence of fingerprints. Recommend preservation of body for period exceeding standard protocol. Dermal structure incompatible with human origin. Forward for advanced genetic analysis immediately urgent. The massive problem, the thing that made my hands shake as I read those words. I have absolutely no memory of writing this message, none whatsoever. I swear by everything I hold sacred, the tone doesn't match my usual professional writing style. The phrasing feels foreign, and even stranger. More unsettling. The email terminated mid-sentence, as if I'd been interrupted during composition or forced to stop typing. But it exists there in my files, registered with date and timestamp, showing I created it. Comparte tu experiencia en los comentarios comenzando con Yo siento que... Porque cuando expresamos lo que sentimos ante verdades que desafían nuestra comprensión de la realidad, cuando admitimos el miedo y la confusión que estas revelaciones provocan, creamos un espacio donde otros pueden encontrar el valor para compartir lo que han visto, pero nunca se atrevieron a decir en voz alta. From that point forward, I became somewhat obsessed with finding patterns, couldn't let this mystery rest. I began systematically searching through cases of unidentified indigent deaths, bodies processed through our system without ever being claimed or named. Between 1999 and 2022, spanning more than 2 decades of records, I discovered 7 bodies presenting with total absence of fingerprints, 7 impossible cases, All were men, all fell within the 30 to 40-year age range, all sharing these characteristics. None had any history of hospital admission, police contact, or public service employment that would leave documentation. Every single one possessed that eerily clean body, completely free of calluses from work, absent of scars from childhood injuries or adult accidents, pristine in a way that human bodies simply aren't after 3 or 4 decades of living. And what made me stop my investigation entirely, what filled me with a dread I can't adequately describe, was this final detail I uncovered. In 5 of those 7 official autopsy reports, the fingerprint collection process was attributed to the same name, the same technician, a necropsy specialist who died in 2005, whose death certificate I personally signed, whose burial I attended and witnessed. I watched them lower his coffin into the ground, but his name continues appearing in reports, his signature showing up on documents created years after his death. Same employee code, identical digital signature authorization. And if you're thinking, this must be simple system error, database glitch that accidentally attached old credentials to new cases, answer me this. How does the exact same error occur in files that aren't even connected to each other, stored on different servers, created in different facilities? How does the same dead man's name appear across different years, on different computer systems, and always, exclusively, in cases where nobody can be identified, where fingerprints mysteriously don't exist? I attempted to pursue this investigation further even after retirement, couldn't let it dissolve into silence. I reached out to people still working active duty, colleagues I'd trained decades earlier. I sent detailed emails to someone in the Internal Affairs Department, a woman I'd worked with who I thought might have the authority to investigate properly. No response ever came, my messages vanishing into digital void. I tried accessing the archived files using my old login credentials, thinking my years of service would grant me some continued access. Blocked immediately, every password denied. I requested formal access as an external consultant, citing my experience and security clearance history. Request refused without explanation or appeal process. An acquaintance who works in IT told me somewhat apologetically, clearly uncomfortable with what he was revealing, that my name had been placed on a list of unauthorized access attempts flagged in their security system, and there was nothing he could do to help me, couldn't risk his own position. That warning lit up every alarm in my survival instincts, told me I was touching something that powerful people wanted to remain hidden, something protected by systems far beyond what a retired medical examiner could challenge or expose. I had never accessed anything beyond my own authorized protocols, never once stepped outside my designated permissions or clearance level. That's when I focused on what I still possessed, what they couldn't reach through digital networks, my own personal backup files, external hard drives stored physically in the cabinet at home, disconnected from any system. And then, with timing too convenient to be coincidence, the external hard drive failed completely. Simple as that, sudden and absolute. When I connected it to my computer, the indicator light illuminated showing power, but the system didn't recognize any data, couldn't read a single file. I took it to a computer technician I'd used for years, someone I trusted with sensitive equipment. He examined it carefully and delivered news that made my skin prickle with unease. The drive had been completely wiped, formatted recently by someone with technical knowledge. But I lived alone in my apartment, had for years since my wife passed. Nobody else had access to that space, nobody touched my belongings, and the hard drive had never left that locked drawer since I'd placed it there. I'd seen this kind of thing in television crime dramas, you know. Mysterious evidence disappearing, files erased by shadowy operatives. In real life, we assume these scenarios are fiction, exaggerated for entertainment. But at this point in my investigation, either I was losing my grip on reality, descending into paranoid delusion, Or there were people with reach and resources who desperately didn't want me remembering, didn't want these connections documented anywhere. And that's when a memory surfaced, a case that had nearly slipped past my attention entirely. It occurred in 2014, never even entered the official missing persons registry because the body had been released and classified as accidental drowning, case closed without investigation. But there was something different about this one, something that didn't fit the pattern I'd been tracking. He had fingerprints when he arrived, normal ridges and whorls visible on initial examination. But then, during the actual autopsy procedure, they vanished while we worked. I remember this specifically because the intern assisting me that day came rushing over nervously, pulling at my sleeve and saying with genuine fear in her voice, "Doctor, the fingers are erasing themselves, the prints are disappearing." I initially assumed she was simply nervous, that this was impression rather than observation, perhaps stress affecting her perception. But I went to look for myself and witnessed something impossible. The fingertips were indeed becoming smooth right there before our eyes, not through necrosis or normal decomposition, not standard tissue breakdown or skin sloughing. It appeared as if the skin was regenerating, becoming fresh and new while we watched. Transforming on the autopsy table. ¿Cuántas veces has ignorado lo imposible simplemente porque aceptarlo significaría admitir que las leyes que creíamos absolutas pueden ser violadas por fuerzas que no comprendemos ni controlamos? I immediately ordered everything suspended, stopped the autopsy mid-procedure, and went to perform a second collection attempt using photographic documentation. I captured 3 images of those transforming fingertips, 3 pieces of visual evidence. Today, only 1 photograph remains accessible. The other 2 files corrupted mysteriously, became unreadable despite being stored on the same device. The surviving image is saved on a USB drive that has never connected to the internet, kept inside a medication box in the back of my closet. I look at it sometimes, study that face in the photograph, and I'm overwhelmed by the sensation that I've seen this person before, that this same face has passed through my examination room on multiple occasions. But it's difficult to say with certainty, because these are faces that don't stick in memory, bodies that leave no impression, perfect absences designed to be forgotten the moment you look away. And then you begin asking yourself questions that undermine your understanding of reality. Is this human, or is this something constructed to appear human enough, to pass inspection just until the moment of disposal when scrutiny ends? I don't know if these represent some subspecies of humanity, don't know if they're products of experimentation, don't know if they're people who've been altered through procedures I can't imagine. But I know one thing with absolute certainty that I'd stake my professional reputation on. Nobody should be able to pass through hospitals, through morgues, through fires and disasters without leaving any trace whatsoever, without generating documentation or raising questions. And I witnessed this impossibility repeatedly, signed off on these cases, stamped these bodies as processed and identified when they were neither. In 2021, I discovered something that shattered what remained of my rational framework. I found the name of one of those unidentified indigent bodies appearing in a new autopsy report, the same name that the deceased technician had used, but this time he appeared listed as the accompanying relative of a different body, someone claiming the deceased. Name, taxpayer ID number, state identification, everything properly filled out and documented. When I searched that ID number in government databases, it came back valid and active. Originally created in 2006, most recently updated in 2020 with a current address. But this man has been dead since 2005, buried in documented grave, autopsy report signed by my own hand, death certificate filed with the state. I accessed the system one final time, captured a screenshot of this impossibility, saved it to the same USB drive with the photograph, and then permanently deleted my search history. I never attempted to access internal systems again after that day, understood I'd pushed as far as I could without triggering consequences I wasn't prepared to face. Nowadays, I don't trust anything that exists as digital file, anything that can be accessed remotely. If it can be erased by someone with sufficient access and motivation, then it can be altered, rewritten, transformed into whatever narrative serves their purposes. I considered telling this story earlier, attempted to find journalists or investigators who might listen. But who would believe a retired medical examiner talking about bodies that seem to reappear across decades, people without fingerprints walking among us, names continuing to sign official documents years after their owners were buried in the ground? Nobody wants to hear this testimony. Nobody wants to acknowledge these implications. But what finally convinced me to record this account, to risk whatever consequences might follow, was something simple and terrifying. 2 months ago, my building's doorman handed me correspondence without return address, a plain envelope with my name written in generic letters. Inside was only a single sheet of paper, nothing else. It was a photocopy of my autopsy report from 2008. The case of the smooth man, the first impossible body. But someone had added an observation at the bottom margin, a phrase written by hand in ink that had bled slightly into the paper. "You never should have let this leave the medical examiner's office." That sentence isn't a threat exactly, though it carries menace. It's a reminder, a warning, that someone has been watching my investigation, tracking my attempts to document and expose. And the strangest detail, the part that keeps me awake replaying in my mind, I recognize that handwriting intimately. It's mine, unmistakably my own penmanship. Deja tu testimonio en los comentarios con las palabras "Yo he aprendido que", porque cuando compartimos lo que hemos aprendido de las sombras, cuando admitimos que la educación más importante a veces viene de las verdades que preferimos no conocer. Construimos sabiduría colectiva que nos prepara para lo inimaginable que podría estar esperando justo fuera de nuestra vista. I'm not asking you to believe everything I've said here. Don't need your faith or validation. I just wanted this registered somewhere, preserved in a form that might survive whatever comes next. Because if someday this type of person or thing stops passing unnoticed, stops slipping through our systems without leaving traces, perhaps you'll remember that someone already saw them. Someone tried to warn the rest of us about what moves among our institutions. I'm going to be direct about what I'm sharing, because if I circle around the facts, it sounds like invention, and what happened contains nothing fabricated or exaggerated. In 2018, I worked as a forensic physician in Curitiba, a position I'd held for several solid years by that point. More specifically, I specialized in identification through bone characteristics, that particular branch of forensic work that engages when the body can no longer speak for itself through facial features or fingerprints. It wasn't glamorous work, never pretended to be, but I genuinely loved what I did, found deep meaning in it. I loved giving names back to people nobody called anymore, restoring identity to those who'd been reduced to numbers and case files. Until the day they returned a body to me without its head attached, and the way they handled that situation, the institutional response to that impossibility. That's why I'm speaking here now, despite the risks. He was an indigent case, one among so many nameless dead who passed through our system. He entered our records as case 237B, mixed-race male, estimated age between 50 and 60 years, showing clear signs of long-term homelessness, heavily bearded, dangerously thin, visible marks of untreated psoriasis, cracked feet from walking barefoot on pavement. Behavioral indicators suggesting chronic untreated schizophrenia, evident even in death. You could see it in his eyes, in the expression frozen on his face, even without life animating it. Cause of death: multiple organ failure resulting from severe malnutrition, a clean cold report identical to many others I'd written. Since nobody appeared to claim or identify him, he was placed in the conservation queue, as we call it, the 48-hour period where bodies await either release or family recognition. But that particular weekend, our medical examiner's facility was completely overwhelmed, processing far more bodies than our refrigerated storage capacity could handle. This happens periodically during heat waves or major incidents. In such situations, we maintain partnership with a local university that temporarily receives bodies, a common practice with proper authorization. I personally signed the transfer authorization form, body identified as 237B, bag sealed and labeled with time and date, everything correct and documented. 3 days later, he returned to our facility. Same bag, same seal showing no tampering, same case number. But when we opened that bag for final processing, there was no head, just empty space where it should have been. The skin at the base of the neck appeared intact from external examination, but internally, the cavity was hollow, as if someone had removed the skull with surgical precision and then crudely reassembled the outer tissue to conceal the theft. And in that moment, I knew with sinking certainty that my career was about to end, because I was going to ask questions that powerful people didn't want answered. The first person I confronted was the coordinator of the university's anatomical laboratory, the facility where our body had supposedly been stored safely. He told me with bureaucratic calm that the skull had been removed for academic purposes, that since the body was indigent, it fell under provisions allowing use for educational study. I requested the authorization form that would document this removal. None existed. I demanded to see the donation documentation that would legally permit this. Nothing on file. I asked for the name of whoever had authorized this extraction. Silence, uncomfortable and absolute. That same day, I attempted to file an official incident report, but when I accessed our internal system, case 237B already appeared classified as voluntary donor, authorized through signed consent form, and there on the digital document was a signature that wasn't mine, didn't match any colleague's authorization, completely fraudulent. The system claimed that the skull had been removed at the medical examiner's office by me personally, at the request of a neuroanatomy course. No such course existed in any university schedule that semester, I verified thoroughly. The document I myself had signed, authorizing only transportation, nothing more, had vanished completely from the database. I went to confront my superiors, demanded explanation and investigation. They told me I must have misunderstood the protocols, must be confused about procedures, and if I continued creating noise about this situation, they would place me on leave for inappropriate conduct and protocol violations. They used that excuse, delivered with paternalistic concern. You're being too sensitive about this, taking it too personally. The following week I was placed on preventive leave, effectively suspended while they reviewed the situation. That's when I began examining historical cases, bodies that had been transferred to university facilities in previous years, and the depths of this system, the scope of what had been happening, that became devastatingly clear. I pulled records for 18 previous cases, all involving people without identification, without families to ask questions or demand accountability. In 12 of those cases, records mentioned anatomical maintenance at external location, bureaucratic language obscuring what had actually occurred. When those bodies eventually returned to us, some came with technical addendums written by hand that stated, "Return with partial bone alteration, complete absence of fingerprints due to decomposition, bilateral ocular void due to deterioration." But I'd seen the before photographs, had examined these bodies initially. In 3 of them, the skull cap had been surgically removed. 5 were missing hands entirely, severed at the wrists. 1 returned without eyes, sockets empty and cleaned. Two came back sewn internally within the thoracic cavity, as if something had been manipulated inside and then crudely disguised, organs rearranged or removed, and one body never returned at all, simply disappeared from our tracking system. You want to know what's most desperating about this discovery? All the records documenting these alterations had been entered by a system user account that was officially deactivated since 2015, years before these entries appeared. Which means either someone reactivated that account without authorization, or someone with internal access is using a dead profile to cover up extractions that have no legal permission whatsoever, that violate every ethical guideline and law governing human remains. A colleague from the technical department told me something that still turns my stomach when I remember it. She leaned close and whispered, "You're searching for one head, Livia, but this entire system is full of dirty hands, people profiting from parts. It started with envelopes once a month, no return address. Inside, a photograph of a body part, a bone, a jaw, a hand, on a cold metal table. The back of each photo had the same printed words. These aren't parts, they're pieces. Each one has an owner waiting. I took them to the oversight committee, but they ignored me. I contacted the ethics commission. No response. I even spoke to journalists who seemed interested, but the story never ran. The most terrifying part. This could be happening right now. The indigent dead, with no one to ask questions, enter the system as unclaimed and exit as donors without consent. Where did that skull from case 237B go? Who took those hands? No one was ever held accountable. If you have someone who went missing, who died without a name, check the records, because sometimes the medical examiner's office isn't the final stop.